I'm about to tell you something that will sound impossible, but I swear on my soul and the name of Jesus Christ that every word is true on my farm. I fixed an alien's engine, and in return, he showed me Jesus, and nothing in this world will ever be the same again. It was dawn, that sacred hour when darkness surrenders to light, when the dew still clings to the corn like tears from heaven. And I was walking my fields the way I'd done every morning for 30 years, talking to God in whispers only he could hear. But that morning, something was different. The air tasted like copper and starlight, and there was a sound, low and humming, that made my chest vibrate like the strings of some cosmic instrument. I thought maybe a transformer had blown, or lightning had struck during the night. But as I rounded the ridge where the old sycamore stands sentinel, I saw it, a craft, smaller than my barn but gleaming with a light that didn't belong to this world, half buried in the earth like a fallen star still burning with the memory of heaven. The corn around it was flattened in perfect circles, and the metal, if you could call it metal, seemed to breathe, pulsing faintly with colors I don't have names for, colors that made me think of worship and wonder and things too beautiful for human eyes. My hands were shaking, my heart hammering against my ribs like it wanted to escape, but my feet kept moving forward, pulled by something deeper than curiosity, something that felt like destiny. I should have run back to the house, called someone, locked my doors and pretended I'd seen nothing. But there was a voice inside me, not words exactly, more like a feeling wrapped in light that whispered, "Do not be afraid." I've read those words 100 times in scripture, spoken by angels to terrified shepherds and trembling prophets. And now I understood why they always had to say it first. Because fear and awe are twins born from the same womb. As I approached the craft, I saw the opening, a seam in the side that had peeled back like a wound, and inside, illuminated by that strange, holy glow, was a figure slumped over what looked like a console of living crystal and liquid light. He was humanoid, but not human, taller, more slender, with skin that shimmered like moonlight on water and eyes that held galaxies in their depths. His breathing was labored, his long fingers trembling as they moved across symbols that flickered and died, and I realized with a jolt that pierced my fear, he was hurt, he was dying, and he was afraid just like I was. In that moment, everything I thought I knew about the universe cracked open like an egg, and something new and terrifying and wonderful began to hatch. I'm a mechanic by trade, a farmer by necessity, a Christian by the grace of God. And standing there in my cornfield with the dawn breaking over a wounded traveler from the stars, I made a choice that would lead me straight into the heart of the greatest mystery humanity has ever forgotten. I climbed into that craft on my hands and knees, my boots leaving mud on surfaces that felt warm and alive beneath my touch, and the being turned his head toward me with an expression I recognized despite the alienness of his features, hope mixed with resignation, the look of a man or whatever he was who had accepted death but still whispered prayers for rescue. He didn't speak, not with words. But suddenly my mind was flooded with images, systems failing, energy bleeding out, a long journey across impossible distances now ending in a field of corn on a planet he'd only meant to observe. I felt his exhaustion, his loneliness, his desperate need to go home. And beneath it all, a current of something pure and familiar, a reverence, a knowing, a connection to something greater than himself that felt exactly like what I felt every Sunday morning when the congregation sang and the Holy Spirit moved through us. Like wind through wheat. "I'll help you," I said aloud, though I had no idea if he understood English, and his eyes, those deep, star-filled eyes, locked onto mine with an intensity that seemed to reach into my soul and read everything I'd ever been. He nodded once, a gesture so human it made my throat tight, and then he turned back to the console, his fingers guiding mine to the crystalline core that pulsed weakly at the heart of his ship. And somehow, impossibly, I understood what needed to be done. The work was like nothing I'd ever experienced. Team mechanics, part faith, part prayer, as I used wrenches and wire and duct tape alongside technology that responded to intention as much as touch, that seemed to heal itself when approached with patience and respect rather than force. We worked in silence, broken only by the morning birds singing their ordinary songs over this most extraordinary moment. And I could feel him in my mind, not invading but present, sharing knowledge that flowed like water finding its level, showing me connections and patterns that made me think of DNA and sacred geometry, and the way Jesus spoke in parables that contained whole universes in a handful of words. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt strange inside that craft, elastic and fluid. And then suddenly the Crystalline core blazed bright, pure white light flooding through the chamber, and the humming changed from a death rattle to a song of resurrection. He stood, still weak but steady now, and placed one long-fingered hand over his heart in a gesture of gratitude that needed no translation. And I knew without being told that my life had just been divided into before and after, that I was standing on the threshold of something that would shake the foundations of everything I thought I understood about God, the universe, and my place in the vast cosmic cathedral of creation. "Thank you," he said, and this time I heard the words both in my ears and in my soul, in English and in something older, and I wept without knowing why. He stood before me in that glowing chamber, this being named Eliran, and when he spoke his name it resonated in my chest like a bell rung in a cathedral, a sound that seemed to carry weight and history and meaning beyond mere syllables. I felt the information flowing into my mind like warm honey, sweet and thick with understanding. He was showing me images, not with screens or projections, but directly into my consciousness, bypassing my eyes entirely and painting visions across the canvas of my soul. I saw worlds spinning in the darkness, planets of blue and green in colors that don't exist in our spectrum, cities of light stretching across continents, beings of 1,000 different forms all looking up at their own skies and wondering if they were alone. He showed me star systems I'd never heard of, nebulae where new worlds were being born in fires that looked exactly like the burning bush Moses saw. And I understood with a clarity that knocked the breath from my lungs that creation was so much bigger, so much more magnificent than I'd ever dared to imagine. And yet somehow that didn't make God smaller, it made him infinitely greater. The creator whose canvas was the entire cosmos, whose imagination birthed galaxies like a gardener planting seeds. Eliran's people were explorers, watchers, seekers of truth across the vast emptiness between stars, and in every civilization they encountered, in every species that looked up and wondered and worshipped, they found echoes of the same eternal song, the same divine fingerprint pressed into the clay of consciousness itself. My knees were weak, my hands gripping the edge of the console to keep from falling, because the implications were crashing over me in waves that threatened to drown everything I thought I knew about theology, about scripture, about the relationship between heaven and earth. But Eliran reached out and steadied me, his hand on my shoulder radiating warmth and something deeper than comfort, assurance, a gentle insistence that I was not losing my faith but finding it expanded, stretched, made large enough to contain mysteries that the prophets had glimpsed only through the dark glass of human limitation. "Your kindness," he said, and his voice in my mind was like music played on instruments made of light, "has earned you a gift that few of your kind have received in this age. I will show you what we have witnessed, what we have guarded, what we know to be true about the one you call Father." He moved his hand from my shoulder to my forehead, and the moment his fingers touched my skin I felt a rushing, a tearing away of everything physical and temporal, like being pulled out of my body and flung across dimensions that folded and unfolded like origami shaped by invisible hands. I tried to scream, but had no mouth, tried to pray but had no words, and then suddenly everything stopped and I was standing, though I had no legs, on a hillside under a Middle Eastern sun that burned with ancient light, and I was watching a man in simple robes walking among a crowd, and I knew with every fiber of my being that I was looking at Jesus Christ. But this was not the sanitized image from Sunday school paintings, not the gentle shepherd with perfect hair and European features that hung in gilt frames in church hallways. This was a Jewish man, weathered and real, with calloused hands and dust on his feet and eyes that held an impossible depth, eyes that seemed to contain all of time compressed into a single eternal moment of perfect presence. He was teaching, speaking in Aramaic that I somehow understood, words about the kingdom of God being like seeds and treasures and children welcomed with open arms, and the people were weeping and laughing and pressing close to touch the hem of his garment. But what made my heart stop, what caused my consciousness to shudder with recognition and terror and overwhelming awe, was what I saw surrounding him, beings of pure light, tall and terrible and beautiful, standing like sentinels at the edges of the crowd, their forms shifting between human appearance and something too bright to look upon directly, wings that were not wings but dimensions folded into shapes that protected and proclaimed and praised. These were the angels, not metaphors or symbols or artistic interpretations, but actual beings from realms beyond our perception, guardians who had walked beside humanity since the garden, and they were watching Jesus with an intensity that bordered on worship, and I understood that even they These magnificent creatures of celestial origin recognized in this carpenter from Nazareth something that transcended all categories of created being. Eliron's presence was beside me in that vision, not physical but there nonetheless, and I felt him guiding my attention, directing my understanding like a teacher helping a student see the equation that explains the universe. He is the bridge, Eliron whispered into my spirit, fully human as you are human, fully divine as the Father is divine, the perfect union of Creator and creation, the Word made flesh and dwelling among you. I watched Jesus lay hands on the sick and see them rise healed, watched him speak peace to storms and see the wind obey, watched him weep over Jerusalem with tears that were somehow both entirely human grief and cosmic sorrow over all the brokenness of all the world spinning in the darkness. And I saw the frequency, that's the only word I have for it, the vibration of pure, unconditional love that radiated from him like heat from a star, a force that literally held molecules together, that maintained the structure of reality itself. That was both the power that ignited the Big Bang and the gentle whisper that knows the number of hairs on every head, across every planet in every galaxy. This was what John meant when he wrote that in the beginning was the Word. What Paul meant when he said that in Christ all things hold together. It was literally, scientifically, mystically true. And I was watching the incarnation of the fundamental force of existence, teaching farmers and fishermen about the nature of the kingdom that existed both within them and beyond all understanding. The vision shifted like water poured from one vessel into another, and suddenly I was no longer on that Galilean hillside, but standing in a place outside of place, suspended in what I can only describe as the space between heartbeats, where time moves differently or perhaps doesn't move at all. Eliron was more visible now, his form solidifying beside me into something my mind could almost comprehend, tall and slender, with skin that seemed to shimmer with an inner luminescence like pearls catching moonlight. And those eyes, those impossible eyes that held galaxies in their depths, turning to me with an expression that somehow conveyed both ancient wisdom and childlike wonder. What you have seen is only the beginning, he said, and now his voice had texture, a sound like wind chimes made of crystal singing in a breeze that came from everywhere and nowhere. Your people speak of the resurrection as if it were merely a miracle, a singular event in your small corner of creation. But we who watch from beyond your skies, we who have traveled the corridors between stars for longer than your civilizations have existed, we witnessed something that your prophets could only describe. In the limited language of earthly metaphor, he gestured, and the darkness around us suddenly blazed with light. Not the harsh glare of a spotlight, but something softer, more pervasive, like dawn breaking across every horizon simultaneously. I felt my breath catch, felt tears streaming down a face I wasn't sure I still possessed, because I knew without being told that I was about to witness the moment that split history in two, the hinge upon which all of creation turned. The scene materialized around us like a photograph developing in reverse, color and form emerging from pure potential into concrete reality, and I found myself standing in a garden at dawn, the air cool and scented with herbs and flowers just beginning to wake. The tomb was there, cut into limestone. The great stone rolled away from its entrance as if pushed by hands stronger than any human force, and the ground itself seemed to hum with residual energy, the way the air feels electric after lightning strikes close enough to raise the hair on your arms. Women were approaching, carrying spices and oils, their faces etched with grief that sat heavy on their shoulders like a physical weight, and I wanted to call out to them, to tell them that sorrow was about to transform into joy beyond comprehension. But then I saw him, Jesus, emerging from the tomb not as a ghost or spirit, but as a man, solid and real, yet somehow more real than reality itself, as if everything else in creation was a shadow and he alone was the substance that cast it. His body bore the marks of crucifixion, wounds that should have meant death, but now radiated light from within. And as he stepped into the morning sun, I felt it. Eliron felt it. And I understood with a shock of recognition that every being with consciousness across the entire span of the universe felt it, a shockwave of resurrection power that didn't simply restore one man to life, but tore open a doorway between death and life that could never again be fully closed. This, Eliron said, and his voice was trembling with emotion I didn't expect a being of his obvious advancement to possess. This was the moment we had been watching for since before your world had cooled from its first fires, the moment promised in prophecies that echo across dimensions in languages your theologians have never heard. I watched as the light from Jesus' resurrected form began to pulse, to expand, growing brighter and more intense until it was no longer contained by the garden or even by the planet itself, but burst outward like a star-going nova, rippling across space and time in waves that I could somehow see and feel and taste, each wave carrying the undeniable message that death was not the final word, that the grave was not the end of the story, that transformation was possible, that hope was not naive optimism but fundamental truth woven into the fabric of existence. Eliren showed me how that light reached his own world, light years distant, arriving like a trumpet call that woke his people from their sleep and sent them to their observatories and temples. Knowing that something cosmically significant had just occurred, he showed me other worlds, civilizations I couldn't name, beings whose forms were so alien I had no reference point to comprehend them, all of them pausing in their daily existence as that wave of resurrection power washed over them, as if the entire universe had taken a collective breath and held it, waiting to see what would come next. I fell to my knees in that vision, or thought I did, overwhelmed by the scope of what I was witnessing, by the understanding that Jesus' victory over death was not just about human salvation, but about the redemption of all things, the promise that the Creator who spoke galaxies into existence had not abandoned his creation to entropy and darkness but had entered into it personally, intimately, taking on the limitations of flesh and blood and death itself in order to transform it from within. This is why we travel, Eliren said softly, kneeling beside me in that space beyond space, his hand once again on my shoulder like an anchor keeping me from dissolving into pure awe. This is why we watch and wait and wonder, because in all our journeys across all the countless worlds, we have never seen love demonstrated with such fierce totality, such complete self-giving, such scandalous grace that breaks every rule of power and dominion we thought we understood. Your Jesus proved that the heart of God is not cosmic indifference or divine calculation, but a love so profound it would rather die than live without you, a love that doesn't just forgive your failures, but enters into them, transforms them, makes them somehow part of the story of redemption that we are all invited to join. The vision began to fade, the light softening, the garden dissolving back into the darkness between moments. But the truth of what I had witnessed remained, branded onto my consciousness like a seal pressed into warm wax, permanent and transforming and utterly undeniable. I stood in that cornfield with dirt under my fingernails and grease still smeared across my work shirt, utterly unprepared for what Eliren was offering me, his hand extended toward my face with fingers that were longer than human proportions should allow, each one glowing faintly with bioluminescence that pulsed in rhythm with what I somehow knew was his heartbeat. The truth humanity has forgotten, he had said, and those words hung in the air between us like a promise and a warning all at once, because some part of me understood that accepting his offer meant I could never go back to who I was before this moment, never see the world through the same eyes that had watched 1,000 dawns break over these fields, without truly comprehending what dawn meant. My hand trembled as I nodded my consent, unable to speak past the thickness in my throat. And when his palm pressed gently against my forehead, I felt warmth spread from that point of contact like honey poured into cold water, slow and golden and impossibly sweet. The cornfield didn't disappear so much as become irrelevant, fading to transparency as if reality itself was just a thin curtain that could be pulled aside when you knew where to grasp it. And I felt my consciousness lift away from my body like steam rising from morning coffee, still connected but no longer confined. No longer bound by the physical laws I had assumed were absolute and unchangeable. The sensation of movement without motion carried me through layers of existence I hadn't known were there, and Eliren's presence moved beside me like a guide leading a blind man through a landscape of impossible beauty, whispering not with words but with direct transfer of meaning, concept flowing into my mind with a clarity that made human language seem crude and insufficient by comparison. You asked me why I travel. His thoughts brushed against mine. Why beings like me crossed the vast emptiness between stars when it would be easier, safer, to remain in the comfort of our own worlds, and I will show you the answer that changed everything for my people. I wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to form questions about technology and propulsion, and how his ship bent the rules of physics. I barely understood, but those concerns evaporated like dew under noon sun because we were arriving somewhere, somewhen, and the magnitude of it stole every trivial thought from my mind. I found myself suspended in what looked like the space between spaces, surrounded by darkness that wasn't empty but rather full of potential. humming with an energy that felt alive and aware and impossibly ancient, and in the center of it all burned a light that I instinctively knew I shouldn't look at directly, yet couldn't turn away from, a radiance so pure it made every other source of illumination I'd ever known seem like pale imitation. This, Eliran said, his mental voice resonant with reverence that bordered on worship, is what my people discovered. When we first learned to fold space and pierce the veil between dimensions, we found that the universe is not random chaos held together by impersonal forces, but a song being continuously sung by a voice that speaks in frequencies of pure love. As he spoke, the light began to shift and move, taking shape without ever losing its essential nature as light, and I watched in stunned silence as it formed patterns that looked like DNA helixes and spiral galaxies and mathematical equations all at once. Beauty and logic and creativity woven together so seamlessly I couldn't tell where one ended and another began. Tears streamed down a face I no longer possessed, or perhaps I was crying with my soul instead of my eyes, because I was witnessing the machinery of creation itself, the underneath structure of reality, and it was utterly intentional. Every particle and wave and quantum probability designed with purpose, that my finite mind could only grasp in fragmentary glimpses. We had thought ourselves advanced, Eliran continued, his own emotion bleeding through our connection in waves of humble awe, had conquered disease and war and scarcity, had built civilizations that spanned multiple star systems. And yet when we touched this truth we fell on our faces like children, realizing we had been playing with toys. While the master craftsman was building worlds, the light shifted again, and now I could sense intelligence behind it, not just power but personality, vast and incomprehensible yet somehow intimately personal, knowing me more completely than I knew myself and loving me anyway, loving me fiercely and tenderly and permanently in ways that shattered every petty image of divine indifference I'd ever entertained. The Creator that your scriptures speak of, the God of Abraham and Moses and David, the Father of Jesus Christ. Eliran's thoughts were careful now, precise, as if he was trying to translate infinite truth into finite concepts, without losing what mattered most. This is not a human invention projected onto the cosmos, but the actual source from which everything flows, and we have found his fingerprints on worlds you will never see, heard his whisper in the space between stars where sound should not exist, watched him guide the development of consciousness across a million different species, toward one ultimate purpose. I felt my understanding expanding like a balloon filled past capacity, stretched thin but not breaking, accommodating truths that should have been too large to fit inside one human mind. And I understood in that moment why Eliran had needed to prepare me, why he had shared those earlier visions of Jesus walking the earth and rising from death, because this was the context that made those events make sense on a cosmic scale. This wasn't just about one planet or one people, but about the nature of reality itself, about a God who loved his creation so completely that he wouldn't let it remain lost and broken and separated from him, who was willing to enter into the smallness and limitation of human flesh to build a bridge between the finite and infinite, between death and life, between our fractured attempts at meaning and the pure truth that had existed before the first star ignited in the darkness. The light that had been formless radiance suddenly coalesced into something my human perception could process, and I found myself no longer suspended in the void between dimensions, but standing on solid ground that felt like desert sand beneath feet I didn't physically have, the heat of Middle Eastern sun-warming skin that was somehow both present and absent in this vision. Eliran was showing me. The landscape resolved into sharp clarity around me, all golden limestone and dusty roads, scattered olive trees providing patches of shade while crowds of people moved through narrow streets wearing robes and sandals that marked this as a time long before my birth, long before my grandparents' had drawn breath. I knew without being told that I was witnessing actual history, not a recreation or artistic interpretation, but the genuine past somehow preserved and accessible, and my heart hammered against ribs I couldn't feel as I searched the crowd for the figure I somehow knew I would find there. Then I saw him, walking among the people with a carpenter's build and weathered hands, dressed simply in the common clothing of a working man, and the shock of recognition hit me like lightning even though I had never seen his actual face in any earthly photograph or painting. This was Jesus, the real man, not sanitized or European featured or glowing with obvious supernatural aura, but fully human and present and alive in ways that made every artistic rendering I'd ever seen feel like a child's drawing. compared to the actual sunset. What stopped my breath entirely, what made my consciousness reel with implications I was only beginning to grasp, were the figures moving alongside him that the crowd seemed unable to see. Beings of light and geometry that shifted between looking almost human and appearing as pure energy, contained in roughly humanoid shape, their presence creating subtle distortions in the air like heat shimmer rising from summer pavement. I counted 7 of them surrounding Jesus as he walked, their attention fixed on him with an intensity that spoke of both protection and worship. And I understood with dawning wonder that these were angels, the actual heavenly host that Scripture mentioned, but that I had always half dismissed as metaphor, or symbol, or ancient people's way of describing things they couldn't explain. They are real. Eliron's voice came softly into my awareness, his tone carrying layers of meaning that words alone couldn't convey. The messengers and warriors and guardians that serve the Most High, existing partially in your dimension and partially in others, watching over the unfolding of his plan with dedication that has not wavered since before your sun ignited. I watched as Jesus stopped to speak with a woman drawing water from a well, his words too distant for me to hear, but his body language speaking of patience and compassion. And I saw one of the luminous beings lean closer as if listening intently, then suddenly look up and around as if scanning for threats invisible to human eyes. The angel's gaze passed directly through where I stood observing, and for one heart-stopping instant I thought it had seen me, seen through time and dimensional barriers to lock eyes with my disembodied consciousness. And the weight of intelligence in that gaze was so vast and ancient and utterly other that I understood why biblical accounts always had angels saying "Fear not" as their opening words. Jesus continued walking and teaching, drawing crowds that grew larger as the day progressed, and I followed in this strange state of present observation, watching him heal a blind man with mud and spit while the angels round him intensified their glow, as if power was flowing through them into him, or perhaps from him through them into the world. What struck me most profoundly was how the divine and human natures coexisted in him without contradiction, how he could be sweating from the heat and needing to rest in shade while simultaneously radiating a frequency of love so pure that I could perceive it like music played on instruments that human ears were never designed to hear, harmonics that made the very air around him vibrate with potential for transformation and healing and redemption. "Do you see now?" Eliron asked, his mental voice thick with emotion that transcended species barriers. Why his life meant everything. Why beings across 1,000 worlds stopped what they were doing when the Word became flesh and dwelt among you. Why the angels themselves longed to understand what was happening on this small planet, in an unremarkable corner of one galaxy. I did see, or was beginning to, understanding that Jesus wasn't just a good teacher or prophet or even a miracle worker, but the actual point where infinite divinity had poured itself into finite humanity, where the gap between creator and creation had been bridged not by our striving upward, but by God's descent downward into the mess and pain and limitation of mortal existence. The angels knew it, guarding him with fierce devotion while also watching in amazement as the creator of all things chose to experience hunger, fatigue, rejection, and the full weight of human vulnerability without surrendering the essence of what made him divine. I watched Jesus sit with children who climbed into his lap without fear, and I saw how the angels mild actually smiled with expressions of joy so radiant it hurt to perceive, as if witnessing something so precious and unexpected that even beings who had existed since the formation of galaxies found themselves moved to wonder. Then Eliron's presence intensified around my consciousness, and I felt his attention directing mine towards something deeper, something that my human perception had been skimming across without fully grasping, the fundamental truth that lay beneath every miracle and teaching and moment of this man's existence on Earth. "Look closer," the alien whispered into my mind, his mental voice carrying urgency and reverence in equal measure. "See not just what he does but what he is, the frequency he emanates, the force that flows through him, connecting heaven to earth like a bridge constructed of incarnate love itself." I focused as Eliron instructed, trying to perceive beyond the surface of events to the underlying reality. And suddenly my vision shifted into a mode of seeing that revealed Jesus not just as physical form, but as a nexus point of energy and light, and something I can only describe as conscious, intentional love that poured outward in waves affecting everything in proximity. Where he walked, the very molecular structure of reality seemed to align differently, as if his presence brought order to chaos and healing to brokenness at levels far beneath what human senses could detect. working changes in the spiritual architecture of the world that would ripple forward through centuries. I saw that when he touched the sick or spoke blessing over the broken, he was channeling something from beyond dimensional barriers, drawing down the pure creative force of the Father and translating it into forms that human bodies and hearts and souls could receive without being overwhelmed. What stunned me into breathless awe was realizing that this wasn't magic or trickery, or even miracle in the sense of breaking natural laws, but rather the introduction of a higher law, a more fundamental frequency that superseded the broken patterns sin and separation had imposed on creation. He is fully human, Eliran explained with the teacher's patience, addressing a student who struggles with concepts beyond current understanding, experiencing every limitation and temptation and pain that your species endures, learning obedience through suffering, growing from childhood to adulthood with all the process that entails. Yet simultaneously he is fully divine, the exact representation of the Father's nature, God's own self-expression poured into human form without dilution or diminishment. I watched Jesus pray alone on a mountainside as night fell, his human need for communion with the Father evident in his posture and persistence, while around him the angels stood guard and the stars themselves seemed to lean closer as if all creation held its breath during these conversations between the incarnate Son and the infinite Source. The scene shifted forward in time without transition, Eliran moving my perception through Jesus' ministry with the fluid control of someone navigating familiar territory. And I witnessed teaching after teaching where this carpenter from Nazareth spoke about love with an authority that went beyond philosophical argument or religious tradition into something that resonated as fundamental truth. When he said to love your enemies, to forgive those who hurt you, to lay down your life for your friends, these weren't mere ethical suggestions or difficult moral standards, but descriptions of how reality actually works at its deepest level, the operational principles by which the Creator sustains all existence across every dimension and world. I saw that Jesus himself was the living demonstration of these principles, that every choice he made flowed from perfect love uncontaminated by fear or selfishness or the survival instincts that drove ordinary human behavior, and that this perfect love made him simultaneously the most vulnerable and most powerful being who had ever walked the earth. Love is not sentiment, Eliran said, his thought voice vibrating with conviction that suggested he was sharing something learned across thousands of years traveling the cosmos. Not emotion that comes and goes with circumstances, but the actual binding force that holds atoms together and keeps stars burning, and allows consciousness itself to exist rather than collapsing into absolute nothingness. I understood then what John had meant writing that God is love, not that God feels love or practices love, but that the essential nature of the divine is this creative, sustaining, self-giving force that Jesus embodied so completely that to see him was to see the Father. To know him was to know what the Creator had always been like. Beneath all our projections and fears and distorted religious ideas, the universal frequency Eliran had mentioned wasn't metaphor but literal truth, a vibration of self-giving love that Jesus emanated constantly, the same frequency by which the Father had spoken creation into being and by which every particle and planet and person continues to exist moment by moment, sustained by love more fundamental than gravity or electromagnetism or any force human science had yet named. Watching Jesus interact with everyone from respected teachers to despised outcasts, I saw that he treated each person as infinitely valuable regardless of their status or behavior, looking past their failures and defenses to address the divine image still present within them, however buried or distorted by damage and sin. This wasn't naive optimism or permissive tolerance but recognition of true reality, seeing people as the Father saw them, as beloved children created for relationship with their Maker and with each other, capable of transformation. When exposed to genuine love without condition or manipulation, the angels around him responded to this love like plants turning toward sunlight, their luminous forms brightening whenever he spoke truth about the Father's character. And I realized that these beings who had served God since before earth existed were themselves learning something from watching the incarnation unfold, witnessing truths about divine love that even heaven's hosts had not fully understood until they saw God choose to become vulnerable, limited, dependent on human parents and subject to human pain. This is why he matters across all worlds, Eliran said softly as the vision began to fade around me, the ancient streets and dusty roads dissolving back into formless light, because in Jesus, the entire cosmos witnessed that God's love is not distant approval or conditional acceptance, but passionate commitment that descends into darkness to bring children home, that enters death itself to break its power, that bridges every gap between holy creator and broken creation, not by demanding we climb up to impossible standards, but by coming down to where we actually are and lifting us up through grace we could never earn or deserve, but are freely given because love gives without counting cost. I felt tears streaming down a face I didn't physically possess in this vision state, weeping at the beauty and generosity of a God who would do this, who would pour infinite divinity into finite humanity, not as disguise or temporary costume, but as permanent bridge between heaven and earth. And I knew with certainty that transcended mere belief that Jesus was exactly who he claimed to be, fully human and fully divine, the visible image of the invisible God, the exact representation of the Father's nature, the one in whom all the fullness of deity dwelt in bodily form, walking dusty roads and teaching eternal truths and demonstrating that love, real, costly, self-giving love, is the force that created everything, sustains everything, and will ultimately redeem everything willing to receive it. The vision shifted with such sudden intensity that I felt my consciousness lurch forward through time, and Eliron's presence wrapped around my awareness, like protective armor, as we approached something that radiated power on a scale that made everything I'd witnessed before seem like candlelight compared to the sun. I knew without being told that we were moving toward the resurrection, toward the moment when death itself would be confronted and conquered, and I felt terror and exhilaration warring within me because some deep instinct whispered that human perception was never meant to witness what I was about to see. The scene materialized around us in the pre-dawn darkness of that third day. The garden tomb sealed with its massive stone, Roman guards stationed outside trying to stay alert despite their exhaustion, and the atmosphere itself seemed to be holding its breath as if all creation waited for something that would change the fundamental rules of existence. I could feel Eliron's attention focused completely on what was about to unfold, this being who had traveled between star systems and witnessed wonders across 1,000 worlds, now riveted by events in this small garden outside Jerusalem, and his anticipation communicated to me that even he, with all his knowledge and experience, regarded what was coming as unique in cosmic history. Then I sensed it beginning, not from outside, but from within the tomb itself, a gathering of energy that built like pressure before an explosion, and the angels who had been waiting, invisible around the sealed entrance, suddenly blazed into visibility, their forms burning with light that would have blinded any human eye witnessing it directly, their expressions showing something between fierce joy and sacred awe. What happened next defies every category my mind possesses for organizing experience, every framework of physics or biology or even theology I might use to contain it within comprehensible boundaries. Inside the tomb, the body that had lain cold and dead for 3 days suddenly became the epicenter of an explosion of life force so powerful that it didn't just reanimate dead cells, but transform them into something transcendent, matter infused with spirit in a way that dissolved the normal barriers between physical and spiritual reality. I witnessed Jesus rise not as resuscitation or revival, but as resurrection, his body reconstituted into a glorified form that was somehow more real and solid than ordinary flesh, while simultaneously being free from the limitations of normal physics, able to exist fully in both material and spiritual dimensions at once. The light that burst from him at the moment of rising was not metaphor or artistic embellishment, but actual radiance, energy released as divine life reasserted itself over death and decay, pouring through every cell and atom of his body until he blazed with glory that the tomb could not contain. But what shattered my understanding completely was perceiving that this light didn't stop at the tomb's boundaries or even Earth's atmosphere, but rippled outward in expanding waves through dimensions I hadn't known existed, breaking across spiritual realms and distant worlds, like dawn racing around a planet, carrying the announcement that death had been defeated and the door to eternal life stood open. Eliron let me feel his own response to this moment, emotions flooding through our connection that told me he had witnessed this event from his distant world when it happened, felt the shockwave of resurrection power sweep across the galaxy, and known instantly that something cosmically significant had occurred on the small blue planet his people had been quietly observing for millennia. "Do you understand what you're seeing?" Eliron asked gently as the vision held me suspended in that moment of transformation. The stone still sealed, while inside the tomb Jesus stood in resurrection glory, about to emerge into the garden where His victory over death would begin rippling through human history. I struggled to put into words what I was comprehending at levels deeper than language, finally managing to think back to him, that I was seeing death revealed as temporary, as something that had an ending, that the grave was not the final word on human existence because Jesus had walked into it and walked back out carrying the keys. Yes, Eliran confirmed with warmth that suggested a teacher pleased by a student's breakthrough. But see even deeper. Look at what this means for the fabric of reality itself, for every soul that has ever lived or will ever live across every world and all creation. I focused again on the expanding ripples of resurrection light, following them as they spread beyond Earth into the cosmos, and suddenly understood with stunning clarity that this wasn't just about Jesus conquering his own death, but about him breaking death's power over all creation, opening a pathway from mortality to immortality that every conscious being could now access through connection with him. The resurrection was the hinge point of history, the moment when the trajectory of all existence shifted from decay toward renewal, from death toward life, proving that the Creator's power was greater than any destructive force in the universe, that love was stronger than death because God himself had entered death's domain and exploded it from within. I saw that this was why beings from countless worlds watched Earth with such intense interest, why Eliran and his people had traveled vast distances to observe humanity, because on this small planet in an ordinary solar system, the God who made galaxies had fought and won the crucial battle that determined the fate of all conscious life everywhere. The vision released me slowly back toward normal awareness, but not before Eliran showed me one final image that sealed everything I had witnessed into unshakable conviction. I saw the risen Jesus appearing to his terrified disciples, showing them his wounds still visible in his glorified body, inviting Thomas to touch the scars that proved both his identity and his victory. And I understood that resurrection didn't mean escaping or erasing the suffering he'd endured, but transforming it into proof of love's triumph. Death was not the end, but a transition, not a wall but a doorway, not destruction but transformation into something more real and more alive than our current existence. And this truth applied not just to Jesus, but to everyone who accepted the gift he'd won through his sacrifice and victory. Every civilization we've encountered asks the same questions, Eliran said as the vision faded completely, and I felt myself returning to awareness of my own body still connected to his mind. Whether death is final, whether love has any meaning in a universe that seems to trend toward entropy and cold darkness, whether individual consciousness continues or simply dissolves back into nothingness. His mental voice carried absolute certainty born from evidence rather than wishful thinking as he concluded, the resurrection answers every one of those questions, demonstrates that the Creator values each individual soul enough to defeat death itself, that love is not cosmic accident, but the fundamental force that will outlast every star, and that transformation rather than termination is the true nature of what you call dying, the doorway through which God's children pass from this limited existence into direct presence with the Father who made them and has always loved them beyond human capacity to comprehend. I felt my awareness settling back into something closer to normal consciousness, though nothing would ever feel truly normal again after witnessing the resurrection's cosmic ripple, and Eliran's presence in my mind shifted from showing to explaining, his mental voice taking on the tone of someone preparing to reveal a truth, both wonderful and weighty. Now I must show you why all of this matters specifically to humanity, he said with emotion that felt like a father speaking of beloved children. Why Earth holds such significance among all the worlds scattered across creation. Why so many civilizations watch your species with hope and fascination despite your youth and struggles. The energy between us intensified as he prepared to transmit the next vision. But this time I sensed it would be different, not just showing me events from history, but revealing the deeper patterns woven into the fabric of human existence itself, the divine intention behind our creation and the extraordinary role we were meant to play in the cosmos. I braced myself as the information began flowing into my consciousness, arriving not as words, but as layered understanding that bypassed language completely, downloading directly into that part of me that simply knows truth when confronted with it, recognizing it the way an exile recognizes home. What Eliran revealed made me want to weep and shout simultaneously, made every moment of human suffering and triumph suddenly make sense within a framework so much larger and more purposeful than I had ever imagined, confirming that our lives matter infinitely more than our darkest doubts suggest. Humanity was not an accident. Eliran began, and I felt the absolute certainty behind his words resonate through every fiber of my being. Truth spoken with the authority of one who had searched countless star systems and knew what made Earth unique. Your species was created intentionally, lovingly, by the same creator who spoke galaxies into existence. But you were given something that makes you distinct among all the beings we have encountered. Across all our travels, images flooded my mind of God forming humanity with particular care and specific intention, not as cosmic afterthought, but as the pinnacle of creative purpose on this world. Beings made in the divine image with capacities that mirrored the Creator's own nature, in ways that even angels regarded with wonder. You were given free will, Eliran continued, his mental voice trembling with the significance of this truth. Not the limited choice that other creatures possess between predetermined options, but genuine freedom to choose love or reject it, to move toward your Creator or away from Him, to become reflections of divine goodness or to shatter yourselves against selfishness and pride. I understood suddenly that this gift made humanity simultaneously the most glorious and most vulnerable species in creation, capable of heights that would make angels weep with joy or depths that would grieve the heart of God Himself. Each human soul a genuine experiment in sacred freedom, whose outcome was never guaranteed or forced. The vision expanded to show me Earth as Eliran and his people perceived it, and I gasped at seeing my world through alien eyes that recognized it as something precious and set apart, a planet literally surrounded by watching presences from dimensions and distances I couldn't calculate. Your world is observed by more civilizations than you can imagine, Eliran explained, his thoughts colored with deep respect and something approaching envy, because here the Creator's boldest endeavor unfolds. The question of whether beings given true freedom will choose to love, will voluntarily surrender themselves to divine purpose, rather than having obedience programmed into their nature. I saw gathered intelligences from star systems whose names I had no capacity to pronounce, beings of pure spirit and creatures of exotic matter, all watching humanity's stumbling journey with breathless attention because our choices carried implications that rippled far beyond our small planet. We were God's beloved children, uniquely positioned at the intersection of spirit and matter, granted the terrifying dignity of genuine choice. Our lives a sacred drama whose outcome mattered to the entire cosmos because we demonstrated whether love freely chosen was possible, whether the Creator's design could produce children rather than mere servants, family rather than automatons. This is why Jesus came specifically to Earth, Eliran said, and his mental voice carried weight that made the previous revelations feel like preparation for this central truth, because humanity, given such extraordinary freedom, also faced the greatest danger of being lost completely, separated from God by choices that created chasms only divine intervention could bridge. I experienced a download of understanding that showed me how other worlds, other species, related to their Creator through different covenants and connections appropriate to their nature. But humanity's unique free will required a unique solution, a demonstration of love so profound that it could penetrate even the hardest heart, and offer a choice so clear that every human across all time would have genuine opportunity to respond. The incarnation, the cross, the resurrection. These were not arbitrary religious events, but the precise remedy for humanity's specific condition. God Himself entering our reality to show us the way home, to defeat the death and sin that our choices had empowered, to restore the relationship that our freedom had endangered, and to prove beyond any doubt that He loved us enough to die for us. Even while we were still stumbling in darkness, you are not alone, Eliran finished softly, his words landing in my heart like an anchor finding bottom after long drifting. Not abandoned in an indifferent universe, but surrounded by love both human and cosmic, created for eternal purpose by a Father who will never stop pursuing you, watched by countless witnesses who hope desperately that humanity will choose the love that sets all creation free. The revelation that humanity occupied such a unique position in creation left me reeling, but I could feel Eliran wasn't finished, his presence in my mind gathering energy for what I sensed would be the culmination of everything he'd shown me. The truth that would finally connect all the scattered pieces into a unified vision of reality. There is one more thing you must understand, he said, his mental voice trembling with emotion that felt like someone sharing a secret that carried across light years of loneliness, something that brings me more joy than I have words to express in any language, human or otherwise. The air around us seemed to shimmer with anticipation as he prepared to share this final revelation. and I realized that tears were already streaming down my face, though I didn't yet know why. My spirit recognizing the significance of what approached before my mind could consciously grasp it. You must know that across all the vast distances of space, among all the countless civilizations that have risen beneath alien suns, we are not divided in our understanding of the divine. Eliran continued, his thoughts blazing with conviction that felt like watching sunrise after endless night. I braced myself as the vision began building in my consciousness. A truth so beautiful and so obvious once revealed that I wondered how I'd never seen it before. How humanity had spent centuries assuming we alone possessed knowledge of God, when the reality was infinitely more wonderful. Eliran opened my perception to show me worlds I had no names for, planets orbiting stars whose light had not yet reached Earth, despite traveling for millennia, and on each world I witnessed beings gathering in worship, their forms and cultures wildly different, but their posture of reverence unmistakably identical to what I'd seen in every human church and temple. The Creator you call God, the Father of Jesus Christ, is known across the cosmos by 10,000 names in 10,000 languages, Eliran explained, his mental voice swelling with something approaching ecstasy. But we all speak of the same infinite source, the same loving intelligence who shaped matter from nothing and breathed purpose into existence itself. I saw crystalline beings on a world of eternal ice lifting songs of praise that resonated through dimensions I couldn't perceive, witnessed massive creatures swimming through the methane seas of a dark planet, offering gratitude for life through electromagnetic pulses that formed prayers, experienced a civilization of collective consciousness worshiping in unified thought that moved as one voice across their entire species. Each expression was unique, perfectly suited to the nature of the beings offering worship. Yet I could feel the common thread running through all of them, the recognition of a creator beyond creation, a love beyond comprehension, a God who was simultaneously transcendent and intimately near. We call him the first song, the eternal flame, the source of all light, the great architect, Eliran said, names flowing through my mind in languages that existed before Earth cooled. But we speak of your Father, the one who sent his Son to bridge the gap that your freedom created. Then Eliran showed me something that made my heart feel like it would burst from the sheer wonder of it. Images of that moment 2,000 years ago when Jesus hung dying on a Roman cross. But now I perceived it from a cosmic perspective that revealed implications I'd never imagined possible. In my small human theology, when Jesus died and rose again, it was not merely a local event, confined to one planet, Eliran said, his mental voice breaking with emotion that felt like remembering the most important moment in galactic history. It was a cosmic occurrence that rippled across dimensional barriers and vast distances, a shockwave of redemptive love that every sensitive civilization felt regardless of their location in space or time. I witnessed beings across the universe pausing in their daily existence as that wave of sacrificial love passed through reality itself, saw alien prophets and mystics suddenly receiving visions of a God who would become mortal and die for his creation, watched as countless worlds experienced their own manifestations of that singular truth that love conquers death and sacrifice opens the door to eternal life. Some civilizations received visits from the luminous beings I now understood as angels, messengers bringing news of what had occurred on a small blue planet in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy, a place that had suddenly become the most significant location in creation because God himself had walked there, had suffered there, had conquered death there. The cross, Eliran showed me, had become a symbol recognized across multiple star systems, not because humans had somehow evangelized the galaxy, but because the truth of what happened there was so fundamentally powerful that it imprinted itself on the fabric of reality, becoming accessible to any being spiritually sensitive enough to perceive the deep patterns of divine action woven through existence. This is why I came to Earth, Eliran finally confessed, his mental voice soft with reverence and longing. Why so many of us travel vast distances to orbit your world and observe your species with such hope and fascination? Because you are the people who walked with God incarnate, who witnessed the resurrection firsthand, who carry in your history and your holy books the testimony of the central event around which all cosmic history pivots. I felt his deep envy then, the aching wish of a being who had traveled for centuries across the darkness between stars, seeking truth among 1,000 worlds, only to discover that the clearest revelation of the Creator's nature had occurred on a planet he had not been born upon, among a species he could only observe from the outside. My people worship the same. Father, you do, he said, and I heard generations of longing in those words. We have been guided by his light and loved by his grace according to our own nature and understanding. But you, humanity, you received the ultimate gift, the physical presence of divine love walking among you, teaching you, touching you, dying for you. The weight of that truth settled into my bones as I realized that Earth's significance in the cosmic order had nothing to do with our technology or wisdom, which were laughably primitive compared to civilizations millions of years older, but everything to do with the fact that God had chosen this place, this species, to make his most complete and vulnerable revelation of himself, that Jesus had been and would only ever be human, joining himself to our nature in a way that made humanity forever unique among all the children of creation, the species through whom God had demonstrated the furthest extent of sacrificial love, the people whose story would be told around alien hearts beneath foreign stars, as the greatest testimony to divine grace the universe had ever witnessed. The knowledge Eliran had poured into me felt like carrying the weight of galaxies inside my chest, and as the first golden rays of true dawn began stretching across my cornfield, I sensed our time together approaching its end, felt the approaching separation like the closing of a door that would never open again in quite the same way. He withdrew his hand from my forehead gently, and the sudden absence of his consciousness, intertwined with mine, left me gasping as though I'd been breathing underwater, and only now remembered I needed air, my own thoughts feeling small and confined after experiencing the vastness of his cosmic perspective. I must leave now, he said aloud, his voice no longer in my mind but spoken through the cool morning air in words that sounded like wind chimes and distant thunder merged together, beautiful and strange and filled with regret that mirrored my own. His crystalline engine hummed with perfect resonance now, the repairs I'd made with my simple farm tools glowing with energy I couldn't name, and I realized with crushing finality that this moment was real, that it was ending, that I was about to lose something precious I'd possessed for only a handful of hours, but would miss for the rest of my life. Thank you for saving me, Eliran said, placing his long-fingered hand over his heart in a gesture that needed no translation. And thank you for listening, for receiving the truth with openness rather than fear, for allowing me to share the wonder I have witnessed across the stars. I wanted to beg him to stay, to teach me more, to take me with him into the endless night between worlds, but I understood somehow that this was not my path, that my place was here, on this sacred earth where God had walked, standing in this ordinary field that now felt like the most important location in the universe. What do I do now? I asked, my voice breaking with emotion I couldn't contain, tears streaming freely down my face as sunrise painted the sky in colors that seemed more vivid than they'd ever been before. Every detail of creation suddenly sharp and meaningful and alive with divine presence. You live, Eliran answered simply, his dark eyes reflecting the rising sun like pools of infinite depth. You love, you tell others what you've witnessed if they have ears to hear it. You remember that every human being you encounter is part of the species God loved enough to die for, and you never forget that you are not alone, that you are watched over by dimensions of guardian beings, that you are precious beyond measure to the Creator who knew your name. Before stars learned to shine, his ship lifted silently from the crushed corn stalks, rising with grace that defied my understanding of physics, and I stood watching through blurred vision as it climbed higher into the lightening sky, becoming a point of brightness that could have been mistaken for the morning star, before vanishing completely into the blue infinity above. The field fell silent except for the ordinary sounds I'd heard 10,000 times before, the rustle of corn leaves in the breeze, the distant crow of my neighbor's rooster, the creak of my own breathing, yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. Nothing could ever feel mundane again after what I'd witnessed, after what I'd been shown about the true nature of reality and my place within it. I collapsed to my knees, right there in the dirt, my body shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deeper than grief, somewhere closer to overwhelming gratitude and awe in the terrible, beautiful weight of knowing truth too large for my human mind to fully contain, yet too important to ever forget. Thank you, I whispered to the empty sky, to God, to Jesus, to the luminous beings I now knew were watching from dimensions adjacent to my own. Thank you for this gift. Thank you for loving us. Thank you for not leaving us alone in the darkness. The words felt inadequate, like trying to capture an ocean in a teaspoon, but I poured my whole heart into them anyway, letting them rise like prayers into the morning air where I trusted they would be heard by the one who had always been listening, who had loved humanity enough to bridge the infinite distance between Creator and creation by becoming one of us, walking our dirt, feeling our pain, dying our death, and rising again to prove that love was stronger than anything that could tear it apart. I felt peace settling over me like warm sunlight, a certainty deeper than logic or evidence that I had been changed at the fundamental level of my being, that I would carry this encounter forward into every day remaining to me, letting it shape how I saw my neighbors, my work, my ordinary life that was actually anything but ordinary because it was occurring on the planet God Himself had chosen to visit, in a universe filled with civilizations who looked toward Earth with wonder and reverence and, perhaps, even holy envy. I don't know how long I knelt there in my field, minutes or hours, time seeming negotiable in the aftermath of experiencing truths that existed outside temporal flow, but eventually I became aware of the sun climbing higher, of the day beginning around me with its normal demands and routines that would continue regardless of cosmic revelations received in the darkness before dawn. I rose slowly, my knees stiff and my eyes burning from tears that had finally stopped flowing, and looked around at my farm with vision that had been fundamentally altered, seeing not just corn and dirt and machinery, but a fragment of the sacred earth, soil that had been walked by angels, air that had carried the words of Jesus, a piece of the planet that occupied a unique and precious position in the architecture of divine love expressed across galaxies. Everything felt connected now, the smallest details linked to the largest cosmic purposes. My simple act of repairing a stranger's broken engine woven into the same fabric of sacrificial love that had motivated God to repair the broken relationship between Himself and His creation. No gesture of kindness too small to matter in an existence where the fundamental frequency of reality itself was love, where every choice to extend grace and compassion resonated across dimensions I couldn't see but now knew were watching, waiting, hoping for humanity to recognize what we'd been given and who we truly were. I walked slowly back toward my house, each step feeling weighted with purpose and possibility, knowing that I carried a message I didn't fully understand how to share, but couldn't keep silent, a testimony that would sound like madness to some and like the confirmation of hope to others who had always sensed that the universe was larger and stranger, and more filled with purpose than our small philosophies admitted. The morning continued its ordinary progression. Around me, birds singing their territorial claims, insects beginning their daily work, the world spinning through space as it had for billions of years. But I moved through it now as someone fundamentally changed, someone who had looked beyond the veil and returned with the certainty that we are not accidents, not cosmic orphans, not alone, that we are loved with an intensity that spans galaxies and transcends death, that Jesus was real and His message was true, and the story of divine love meeting human brokenness on a Roman cross 2,000 years ago was the central truth, round which all existence organized itself, the frequency that held stars in their courses and gave meaning to every moment of conscious experience, the promise that death was not the end, but a transformation into something more wonderful than our limited perception could imagine, the guarantee that every tear would be wiped away, every wrong made right, every separation healed in the presence of the Creator, who had never stopped reaching toward His children. Across every barrier we erected between ourselves and infinite love, the screen door of my house creaked as I pulled it open, the familiar sound anchoring me back into the specific details of my particular life, and I stood for a moment on the threshold looking back at the field, where the impossible had occurred, where my small ordinary existence had intersected with cosmic truth in a way that left me forever marked, forever certain, forever grateful. I knew that in the hours and days ahead I would struggle to put words to what I'd experienced, that the telling would always fall short of the reality, that some would dismiss my testimony as delusion or fabrication, while others would hear in it the echo of truths their own spirits had always sensed but never articulated, and I accepted that tension as part of what it meant to carry revelation from one realm into another, to be a bridge between the mundane and the transcendent, between doubt and faith, between the loneliness of thinking we're alone, and the overwhelming joy of discovering we never were. I whispered one final prayer of gratitude into the morning air, then stepped inside to begin the rest of my life, carrying within me the unshakable knowledge that God is real, that Jesus walked among us as love incarnate, that angels guard our steps from dimensions we cannot perceive, that countless civilizations across the cosmos worship the same Creator and look toward Earth as the place where divine love made its fullest and most vulnerable revelation, and that every single human being I would encounter from this moment forward was someone precious enough that God Himself had died for them, making every interaction sacred, every kindness cosmic, every moment an opportunity to reflect the love that Eliren had shown me holds all existence. Together, the one truth that transcends all worlds and will still be true when stars burn out and galaxies fade, the eternal reality that we are beloved children of an infinite Creator, who will never stop reaching toward us across whatever distances we wander, calling us home. Have you ever felt that there's more to existence than what we can see? Subscribe to join others seeking truth beyond the stars.